Empty Chair is a therapeutic experiment to resolve unfinished business and conflict within self. Empty Chair arose from Gestalt therapy as a tool used to bring wholeness. So in Gestalt, this technique is called an experiment. It's a procedure done between the therapist and the client to quickly help the client yield awareness of incongruence in the self. And this awareness is the healing. So to best understand Empty Chair is to understand it in context to its origins in Gestalt therapy. So Gestalt therapy, like Gestalt psychology, purports that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. The whole has meaning, while parts alone confound, until there are enough parts collected to deduce a whole. In this experiential theory, therapists seek to form Gestalten by bringing awareness of details in the client's behavior in the present that reveals conflict within the client, and that becomes the material to create the experiment and becomes the mechanism to bringing meaning and wholeness. Unconscious is not seen as the center of an onion that one must unpeel layer by layer, as in psychodynamic theory. Rather, it's not difficult to access, for it's revealing itself incessantly through intrapersonal communication. So through awareness, Empty Chair easily brings parts from the background to the foreground. And without this awareness of parts, of vague incompleteness and fragmentedness just encumber one's life. So repression is not seen as real, for the body's constantly sending the conflict out, and Empty Chair is this prime tool used to examine those conflicts hiding right in plain sight in the here and now. In Empty Chair, to access the unconscious awareness easily in session, the therapist observes the client's behaviors and emotions with these questions in mind. What are you doing? What do you feel? What do you want? What do you avoid? What do you expect? These observations reveal the fractured parts that are presenting themselves here and now. And they are there because they want completion. They want resolution. And these fractured parts are called splits, these warring conflicts within the self. And when these splits are seen, the therapist can suggest the Empty Chair experiment. So recognizing splits in a person's functioning is integral to this. And these splits are the portal for the client and the therapist's work. So splits are characterized by the nature of two parts, and they can be recognized in three ways. The first, conflict. So an unresolved internal struggle that seems to be in opposition within self. This would be, I want to, but I just can't. So indicated with but, why, yet, if, even shoulds and musts. And you can see this in behaviors when a client is smiling while telling a tragic story. Subject-object. And this is when part of the self, the subject, does something to the passive part of the self, the object. This is indicated with the pronouns I, myself. So receiving behaviors from the self, like I'm disgusted with myself for saying that. To find the split in behaviors, one could even look at the hands. One hand squeezing, a passive hand. Attributions. So when a feeling one has is attributed to an object or a person outside of oneself. And this is indicated by using third-person pronouns or object indicators. An example, my mom thinks I should grow up. She makes me so mad. Well, Pearl said that what was needed for the Empty Chair experiment were the chairs, some tissue, and cigarettes. I'll explain what's needed for this technique, starting with the therapist's operational role. These are the things that the therapist must attend to the client with during the experiment. Primarily, separation and contact, So finding clarity in the client's split parts as distinct and separate, and encouraging those parts to make contact as separate parts. Responsibility means encouraging the client to take responsibility through the use of I statements and to identify with each part of that split. So move away from avoiding and siding with one side or the other while engaging. Instead, each has their own dialogue, each part, and congruence must be felt when embodying either part. Attending, being sharply attuned to the client and focusing their attention to the behaviors, or encouraging them to stay with certain aspects of what they're feeling. This is characterized by the I and thou stance that the therapist holds with their client. Through heightening, the therapist encourages the client to highlight key gestures or language to strengthen their awareness. With expressing, the therapist encourages the client to heighten or exaggerate specific content, feelings, behaviors, to bring clarity through awareness again. Clients must be willing to participate in the experiment. This technique can be applied as a standalone in a single session. As an expressive technique, it's used when there's a disconnect in a client, when they're rather out of touch, and an arousal sensation will help them verbalize abstract thinking. It's been found to be useful to use with clients from a culture that prefer indirect eye contact, since this technique allows deep emotional work to unfold while working with the other in the other chair. There are times it should not be used to resolve criminal victimization from a stranger, combat trauma, severely disturbed psychiatric populations, and then in some trauma-related cases where emotions are already dramatic and highly aroused. In this case, the technique could initiate re-traumatization, self-mutilation, suicide, extreme aggressive behavior. So this method, it's not advised when the client's already at a high level of arousal and may experience flooding. And now let's move into the actual operations of empty chair technique. So pay attention to those fine details in the client's behavior. Look for incongruence indicating a split. And when a split emerges in session, suggest an experiment to the client. This cannot be premeditated. It has to be something you are seeing them experiencing here and now. And the presence of a split reveals itself as an indicator of present readiness for it to be resolved. So 2 chairs are set facing one another. Distinct parts are assigned to the different chairs. There's the experiencing chair or the hot seat where the client progresses and moves away from the incongruence and engages in some sort of internal exploration. And then there's the other chair where the other parts, the other attributes or things are placed. And they do very little experiencing, more reflecting what they're feeling. And the client switches between both chairs, embodying the part separately and completely. The therapist sets up a dialogue between the 2 distinct parts. So the therapist encourages the client with their operational roles that we talked about earlier. And the therapist also encourages the client to speak with I statements from either chair towards the other chair. When the dialogue moves towards resolution, the experiment ends. Because of its success in working through splits, there are many empirical studies that point towards its value as a therapeutic tool, and it sometimes surpasses other therapies as a tool in studies. While Gestalt theory has evaded a lot of that empirical support, the empty chair technique has undergone extensive research. In fact, it's been shown in one study that to be superior to other techniques, and equally effective at CBT or person-centered when resolving splits. decisional conflicts, marital conflicts, unfinished business. One study showed that it surpassed CBT when working through broad issues in marriage. When it's paired with person-centered techniques, it's been shown to be even more effective. And it's far surpassed psychoeducational groups with desired outcomes for growth. Now, there is some criticism to the research. So while empty chair in some studies seems to surpass these other methods, other studies seem to suggest that their value is equal. The studies tend to have small sample sizes, and a few of the studies have some methodological flaws that they're criticized for. But because of its success, it's been borrowed and a valuable technique to other therapies, and it blends well into therapy work by and large. It's commonly used in existential group therapy work, marriage and family therapy, EFT. So some criticism from Christian perspectives is that the theory as a whole and the techniques are too subjective and therefore are red herrings away from truth and true wholeness. And yes, as a standalone concept, they can contradict Christian truths that the heart is deceitfully wicked and that our selfish sin nature is an area to exercise spiritual discipline over. Yet, when introducing Christian principles, these very criticisms become strengths. An example, I can become my true self by recognizing how God completes my parts. And in my imagination, while Satan can disrupt my mind and distort reality, yet in my imagination, God can rectify brokenness and restore outlooks. So there are some Christian circles that embrace this readily. A whole line of Gestalt pastoral care has grown out of Gestalt therapy, and empty chair technique is one of the key experiments that they use within it. And the empty chair is also a powerful tool to bring in consciousness to what is burdening one in the present that needs to be considered before God. Because the client is engaging in the experiment. It is seen as a stance that the Holy Spirit can bring revelation and insight and wisdom into this.